Supposed to. So welcome everybody to this ABC session. We have with us Ricky Price, who is an assistant professor of political science and public law at St. John Fisher University. Hopefully that's correct, because I didn't consult with you beforehand.
See for how long.
And the topic for today is the PEPFAR program. So I think we have a pretty large group. Maybe we can dispense with going around and doing intros for tonight. And I'll just hand it right over.
And I'll show you on the screen who all is here.
Welcome everyone on the Zoom.
There are many.
Wow.
And then I'll take that away so you can see the screen.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much to the Finger Lakes Justice Partnership. Y'all have been such an important space for us, rural LGBTQs down here in the Finger Lakes, and Cuca Compass as well. It's very funny how much time someone who is not religious has been spending in a church this past few months, organizing with you all. And so I don't know, I hear that many people organize their lives with the acronyms AD or BC and AD, right? Before Christ and after death. But I think of my life as BC and after C, which is before Columba and after Columba. And I'm very thankful to be in community with you, dear one. But on a much less exciting note, or less happy note, let's talk about this really complicated program tonight. And yeah, you can move to the next slide. And so I'm going to talk basically about three things tonight. One is, what is PEPFAR and how did it get created? And then what did it actually do for 24 years or 20 years, 21 plus years? And then is this program now dead? And so obviously, if you've been following the executive orders, the things happening with USAID and the general chaos of the Trump administration, what was a staple of humanitarian aid seems to be certainly uncertain, if not fully unreliable at this point.
Can we just make sure the folks on Zoom can see the slides? Can someone, you cannot see the slides.
Yes, we can. I can see the slides.
I can see them.
Sarah.
Oh my goodness, I figured it out. It was my fault.
All right, phew. All right. I don't think there's any more animation, so that was the exciting part. So just to give sort of a baseline of what PEPFAR does, before we get into that, the current state of the global pandemic, it is still affecting over 1 million people a year. And the thing about HIV/AIDS that we certainly know at this point is that you can live a full and healthy life if you have access to medication and healthcare. And so you need daily pills, and you need a lot of access to care and a lot of resources to get those pills into your bodies, and then also the therapies and doctor's visits that requires. So it's not as if it's something that can be cured with a vaccine. And even if there was a vaccine, we would see that be very difficult to roll out. So it is a persistent health problem that requires a lot of maintenance and a lot of investment, a lot of money, a lot of people power to get drugs into bodies cheaply and effectively. And it's also important to note that although a lot of the historization of HIV/AIDS centers on gay men in particular, that for over 2 decades, HIV and AIDS have been the leading cause of death globally for women of reproductive age. And so HIV is a virus that you get from having sex and using drugs. It does not care about your identity. And so because we care about identity in terms of government and community, the politics of HIV/AIDS gets very complicated when we're thinking about who deserves need, who's a victim, who deserves care, and all those sorts of things. Now, I'm part of many social scientists who have criticized PEPFAR in many ways for its limitations. But tonight, I think what's important to focus on is the things that it has done very effectively over the course of this 20-year period. And so you can see from the government's page on PEPFAR, it was up today. I'm not sure how much longer it'll be up. But this program has been one of the most effective attempts at humanitarian aid, certainly since World War II, and has been incredibly effective at lowering transmission rates and keeping people alive. The other thing that's really difficult to understand about HIV is that it is such a powerful virus that it mutates every 48 hours. And that's how it tricks or outwits our immune systems. The immune system, as soon as it's developed antibodies for HIV, the virus has already mutated and created a new version of itself that your immune system has to catch up to. And so because of that dynamic, it's really, really hard to stop. And these drugs that we have are incredible. But if you're taking these drugs for a long period of time to keep your viral load suppressed, and then you end up having to go off of them because of the USAID not funding your drugs, or you can't get your treatment, your virus can mutate and your immune system can adapt so that those antiretrovirals are no longer as effective. So even if PEPFAR makes it through these waiver periods or USAID is able to give the life-saving drugs out, any pause in treatment is incredibly dangerous for any individual, let alone collectively letting the virus continue to mutate and evolve beyond control. And I'm not going to read all this, but just to give you the scope of this program is involved in 55 countries. And what it does is it partners with non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, a lot of religious organizations that then work with local governments, local communities to distribute that care, generally in ways, this is the other thing that some folks praise about this program, with a sense towards the particular cultural and governmental systems of that country, right? So it's not a one size fits all, and it takes into account a lot of different traditions, norms, and thoughts about sex and sexuality and drug use. The other thing that is disturbing, one of the newer programs that you'll see in that last paragraph, the Determined, Resilient, Empowered, AIDS-Free, Mentored, and Safe program has been targeting primarily adolescent girls. That website for that program is now no longer up. And I'm not sure if that means it's been removed, but it's now one of those errors that you get with so many of the government databases that we had access to just a few weeks ago. So then moving into how did PEPFAR become law? So the red marks on this timeline are the military. And so the military is going to be really central into the federal government taking HIV/AIDS seriously because it becomes a national security threat because of the high rates of HIV infection in many global South countries. Those countries become destabilized, and the government, in particular the military, is deeply worried about what happens to these militaries, to these economies, and how does that affect U.S. national interest. So very early on in the epidemic, even though the Reagan administration wasn't outwardly saying much, the U.S. military was working to protect its troops and to develop therapies. And so they become a really important actor in this. The blue timeline moments are areas where there is solidarity movements across the world, from the Treatment Action Group in South Africa to the ACT UP groups all over the US and Europe. And they put tremendous pressure, particularly after antiretroviral drugs were developed in the late 90s, on governments, on the UN, to get drugs into bodies, because the patents, as we all are well too familiar with in this day and age, the patents and the cost of American-produced healthcare is not affordable to us, let alone to countries across the world. And so that's the other part. You notice the U.S. Trade Relations Board, or I'm forgetting what the R stands for. They relaxed drug patents for rules for HIV/AIDS meds, and the orange ones are the Clinton administration, and the Clinton administration was not benevolent. We know the Democrats have to be pushed to open a door for somebody. And so because they have no spine or backbone, it's the activists that are pushing the Clinton and Gore campaign. Well, at that point, it's the Gore campaign for president to make HIV/AIDS and global resistance or drugs globally really part of the pushback of that. And so the Clinton administration tries to assuage the AIDS activists by declaring HIV/AIDS a national security threat, as well as signing one of the first national security resource laws, what would become the the background for PEPFAR. And so again, in 2000, AIDS is the first disease to be declared a national security threat. And so what does that really mean? It means that we can use the giant defense and security apparatus, those resources towards these drugs, towards these healthcare interventions. And so I think it's important here to go back in this moment to some of the activism that forced these politicians to do the right thing, even if it was an imperfect program. And so this is from ACT UP New York's presentation at the 6th International AIDS Conference in Johannesburg, South Africa. We are united with a single purpose to ensure that everyone with HIV and AIDS has access to fundamental rights of healthcare and access to life-sustaining medicine. AIDS has become a catastrophe that threatens the very future of this planet. Terribly high levels of HIV infection and death due to AIDS are now a reality in poor countries worldwide. More than half of these infections are among women. AIDS is causing this widespread devastation in Africa and Asia especially. This was avoidable. And I think we need a banner that says this was avoidable, everything we're going through right now. Some other thoughts that I think are worth thinking about. This is from ACT UP Paris in 2002, a year before PEPFAR is signed into law. Rich countries, developing countries, the United Nations and its agencies need to make a choice, condemn to death millions of people and take public responsibility for their acts in supporting this health catastrophe without precedent. Intervene, finally. And then from the Treatment Action Campaign, Zaki Achma is an incredible activist. Famously in the 90s went on a drug strike, wouldn't take his HIV/AIDS meds to try to get the government of South Africa to fund AIDS meds for everyone, and was successful in that effort. And as he said in 2004, as long as there is solidarity between all of us on the basic principles of the right to life and the right to access healthcare, each country can adopt its own approach, whether it is to create treatment, literacy materials, or campaigns for your government to take serious steps to address the endemic. And so along with that, in this moment that feels unprecedented, I do feel like we can look to ways that people have used this playbook and these ideas to push forward in the darkest of times. So then, right, we get this unlikely ally of the LGBT community, right? George W. Bush, and particularly Mike Pence. And Mike Pence's evangelical Christianity is going to be central to how this develops. And the other thing that is really crucial for the religious right to come together in this moment in 2003 and work with healthcare activists and AIDS activists on this bill, it's a full-on compromise. Now, but the idea from the very get-go is they made sure that no money could go to abortions in this. And there was a fear from right-wing Christians that is never true. It's never been policy. It's never been healthcare practice to treat a mother who has HIV with an abortion to prevent mother-to-child transmission. But that misinformation and that fear loaded the PEPFAR with all of these rules about Christian norms and Christian identity, namely, right, that abstinence and being faithful were the first steps, and then after those two steps, we'd start delivering condoms. And so all of these sort of things made the PEPFAR program much more limited, and yet despite these things, it was still able to deliver so much life to people, right? And in the announcement in his State of the Union speech, he calls PEPFAR an act of mercy to basically innocent victims. And that's really important, right? PEPFAR only funds foreign assistance and foreign aid. It does not address the domestic crisis. It does not lower drug prices in the US. And so it was really important for the conservatives to say that folks who have HIV in the US are sinners, they are wrong, they are deviants, they are perverts, they are drug users, they should be criminalized, they should be put in jail. But in the foreign sphere, it becomes part of soft power and the reach of Catholic and Christian charities. He also ties it to the larger imperial struggle that he initiates in 2003 in Iraq, but obviously had started earlier in Afghanistan. We help liberate and oppress people. As our nation moves troops and builds alliances to make the world safer, we must also remember our calling as a blessed country is to make the world better. This nation can lead the world in sparing innocent people from a plague of nature And this nation is leading the world in confronting and defeating the man-made evil of international terrorism. And so these are really the twin legacies of the Bush administration, this PEPFAR program and the war on terror. And so when we're thinking about why did this bill come together, there's basically three main reasons that I'm putting forth here today. First is that foreign assistance for HIV/AIDS was framed as a different problem at the international and the domestic. We didn't have to talk about queer people. In fact, queer people, LGBTQ people are not mentioned in the bill at all. I've read it multiple times. We're not in there. Activist groups brought the global crisis to the agenda of the UN and Western governments. And so there was pressure certainly at the UN because of the material reality of the crisis. And then also because the military and the national security apparatus saw this as a disease, and it could be framed as being transmitted through sinful practices that needed not hard power of the military, but the soft power of the religiosity of the US people and the compassionate conservative that George Bush ran on as a way to pass it. And so when we're thinking broadly, how did this actually work on the ground? And I've kind of hinted at a lot of these things. A lot of it was through a coalition of on-the-ground networks, public-private partnerships, traditional work that was embedded in terms of working with TB or malaria, other illnesses, as well as working on health infrastructure throughout the global South. Again, there's large bipartisan support because this is a huge amount of money that is going to get drugs into bodies, which is the goal of so much AIDS activism at the time. And then it also offers this huge opportunity for people like Mike Pence and Representative Smith from New Jersey. I think Steve Smith, but I'm forgetting his name. But also Tom Hyde, the famous Hyde Amendment, if you're familiar with that, which prevents government funds from being used for abortions, is also very interested in this. Jesse Helms, who wants to criminalize people, is in support as well. And so it has a really odd group of bedfellows that have come together. And we notice now in the Republican Party, a lot of those folks aren't around anymore. Some of them have been, threatened with hanging. And so there's all of these ways in which this coalition that made up the Republican Party under Bush is not at all interested in these priorities at all. Which makes the future of this program, which has to be renewed by Congress every 5 years, really, really uncertain in terms of that. And again, Pence was one of the original co-sponsors of the bill, and there's none of those original co-sponsors in it. And so there's been sort of this yo-yo is what I'm looking for, this yo-yo back and forth between conservative and Democratic administrations. And primarily it has to do with funding for abortion and what's called the global gag rule, or the Mexico City policy is sometimes what it's called. And basically what this says is that during a certain administration, if it's the Obama administration or the Biden administration, right, then there are situations and areas where funding can be used for reproductive rights or reproductive care. And then during conservative administrations, the Bush administration, the Trump administrations, right, they reversed that global gag rule. And so what most folks who work for USAID or the partnerships that do this, they're used to that yo-yo. That is normal. There are going to be parts of our mission that we cannot do under Democratic presidents versus Republican presidents and vice versa. And so that is a fairly normal schizophrenia built into our system that we've been able to manage and still provide care, if not at the highest levels. And so what's different about this moment in particular, right, is there's no, it's the baby with the bathwater here. And so even though many folks in these programs were fully expecting to have to limit their reproductive rights programs or their condom programs or their birth control programs as part of HIV/AIDS prevention, what happened is that there has just been a total freeze on federal funding for humanitarian aid. Now, there are waivers last week that came out that said that life-saving care would be possible, but it's really unclear to folks on the ground if they're risking criminal activity for engaging in this. There's panic all over, misinformation, and then there's also this nonsense that Trump is doing in terms of South Africa and saying we're going to withhold aid for South Africa until you get rid of these laws that are supposedly targeting white South Africans. And so we're gonna see a lot of that. I think that maybe we're not sure if the funding's cut off. It's not clear. Things are tied up in the law, and Trump is gonna say that he's gonna take funding away or give it based on how much people bow down to him. And so knowing that, we can start to think about how we manage that in our struggles here in the Finger Lakes and beyond. Yeah, I think that's most of what that slide is about. And then this is from an Inspector General audit from last year of where this money is going. Do we know it's actually doing this? Is any of this efficiency argument true? And it's fairly transparent, right? I'm sure there is some malfeasance and some bleed, but like it's fundamentally a pretty solid program as far as government programs go. The other thing is, you see, PEPFAR is not its own institution. PEPFAR is a law that allocates money to give to the Department of State, USAID, and Health and Human Services, the Centers for Disease Control, which have offices all around the world, right, as well as the Peace Corps. And then these are the groups that then help distribute the aid and pass that out. And so, again, as I've kind of mentioned, the nonprofits and public and private partners that deliver the care, drugs, and support are not going to be able to exist after these lawsuits happen, because they've got to pay the bills, they need to pay salaries, and all of that money is dry. From what I'm hearing, like they're not even able to pay, they've already spent most of the money that was allocated to them and they're not getting reimbursed. And so even if PEPFAR is renewed, this infrastructure that has been built over the last 20 years is going to be vastly different, let alone potentially not recoverable. The opportunity to distribute generic, cheap, and effective drugs on this scale may be lost forever. And so this moment, I think, calls us to resist in ways that we can, however we can. And I think before I get to that slide, the other big part of this that is that big opportunity with PEPFAR, I think particularly thinking about fighting against capitalist oppression, is that this law put in this waiver for these medical drug patents on these pills. And so that is something that I don't know we get back in PEPFAR 2.0. I don't know how they are able to convince the pharmaceuticals to cut the prices of those generic drugs. And so I think that also makes us think of different opportunities we might have globally to rethink these treaties and these patent laws, and why can't countries in the global south that have technology to make these pills, why can't they make these pills comes to the forefront, maybe as an option for action rather than trying to save this program that seems like it's going to be very difficult to save. It's up for renewal in March. The Biden administration failed here tremendously. They did a 1-year extension because they couldn't get the Republicans to agree with them on the global gag rule. When Biden lifted the global gag rule in 2021, conservatives framed PEPFAR not as a work of mercy like President Bush did, but as a US funded abortion program operating across the world. And so that is how it's being framed. And I think it also reminds us that the struggle for LGBTQ rights and liberation is already has been forever connected to reproductive rights and struggles beyond sexual identity alone. And so I just want to end with something more powerful. I think being in the streets with many of the folks on these calls the last few weeks has been really powerful. Seeing 100 people in Seneca Falls last week for queer rights, 250 in Geneva a few weeks ago for immigration rights, and even the 30 or 40 of us on the 20th on the inauguration freezing our butts
80.
off. And 80. Oh, there are 80. I'm sorry. I'm dyslexic. I counted them. But yeah, the people, that's what I want to think about as I end with just two quotes from some groups and some people I gain a lot of strength from in this moment. Throughout COVID, I've been reading a lot of Alice Wong's work, particularly Disability Visibility, which just came out and was an online project before it became a book. But I think about her perspective here as we still live through COVID, as norovirus is tearing through our communities and bird flu is right at our doorstep. Disabled, immunocompromised, and chronically ill people know fully well that the world is not designed for us, and how often we are dehumanized and considered burdens by the medical industrial complex. It is an exhausting struggle to be seen and heard while fighting to survive in the face of systemic oppression. And so again, I think if PEPFAR falls and if these projects end up becoming moribund, I think about how do we build the system that will be able to see and include Alice? How will we be able to rebuild this in a more just way as we think through our political analysis of the coming years? And so I'm often reminded of the Denver Principles, which well before ACT UP was founded, this group in Denver, Colorado, at the annual Gay and Lesbian Health Conference, which is the social movement infrastructure for a lot of what LGBTQ groups do in the 80s. They came together to do a sort of manifesto about living with HIV. And since we are all, in a way, are living with HIV, we're all living with COVID, I think it's important to remember these principles as we work together over the coming years. We condemn attempts to label us as victims, a term which implies defeat, and we are only occasionally patients, a term which implies passivity, helplessness, and dependence on the care of others. We are people with AIDS. Recommendations for healthcare professionals. Come out, especially to their patients who have AIDS. Always clearly identify and discuss the theory they favor as to the cause of AIDS, since this bias affects the treatment and the advice they give. Get in touch with their feelings, examples of fears, anxieties, hopes, etc. about AIDS, and not simply deal with AIDS intellectually. Take a thorough personal inventory and identify and examine their own agendas around AIDS. Treat people with AIDS as whole people and address psychosocial issues as well as biophysical ones. Address the questions of sexuality in people with AIDS specifically, sensitively, and with information about gay male sexuality in general and the sexuality of people with AIDS in particular. Recommendations for all people. Support HIV positive people in the struggle against those who would fire them from their jobs, evict them from their homes, refuse to touch them or separate them from their loved ones or community and peers. Since available evidence does not support the view that AIDS can be spread by casual social contact. Not to scapegoat people with AIDS, blame us for the epidemic, or generalize about our lifestyle. Recommendations for people with AIDS. Form caucuses to choose their own representatives, to deal with the media, to choose their own agenda and plan their own strategies. Be involved at every level of decision-making and specifically serve on the boards of directors of provider organizations. Be included in all AIDS forums with equal credibility and other participants to share their own experiences and knowledge. Substitute low-risk sexual behaviors for those which could endanger themselves and their partners. We feel people with AIDS have an ethical responsibility to inform their potential sexual partners of their health status. The rights of people with AIDS, to as full and satisfying and sexual and emotional lives as anyone else, to quality medical treatment and quality social service provision without discrimination of any form, including sexual orientation, gender, diagnosis, economic status, or race, to full explanations of all medical procedures and risks, to choose or refuse their treatment modalities, to refuse to participate in research without jeopardizing their treatments, and to make informed decisions about their lives, to privacy, to confidentiality of the medical records, to human respect, and to choose who their significant others are, to die and to live in dignity. And so this tradition of activism, and even though maybe we have different ethical principles than folks did in 1983, I think particularly this last slide really speaks to where and what we can do together, where we can find North Stars when it feels so dark out, and how we can build on this generations of activism, knowledge, and resources. And again, we're already seeing this happen not only in the Finger Lakes, but was taken by this banner from a rally that happened over the weekend in front of the State Department. And that's more or less everything I was hoping to talk to you all about, and would love to answer any questions or continue any discussion as we continue to fight. So thank you.
He's gonna manage the online presence.
Do you feel comfortable opening it up for questions and
Yeah,
discussion?
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know if those things were
Columba, you need to-
comments or what they were.
Coming on.
Okay.
I got it. No. There we go. It's full screen.
Well, I'll just fill the quiet while that gets switched by saying that was a really great explanation of something that, like, you know, I had the only broadest understanding of, and mostly from just the past few weeks of it being so much in the news. And so I really appreciate you filling in the gaps there, and I have a much better understanding. And it was a really great follow-on from Peter's ACT UP presentation last month. That was a
Yeah, kind of
cool
fit
continuity
both together.
there, so I appreciate that thing. So thank you both.
Thank you, Alex.
A lot of people on there.
There's a lot of people.
Can I ask a question, or should we wait for the online people?
No, you can jump in,
well-
because they're still typing.
Yeah, just to let the people on the Zoom know, if you want to ask a question, I guess you can use the raise hand function or just type in the chat is. So go ahead, Charlie.
So in your view, I'm just trying to like wrap my head around, because as you said, it's like incredibly complex. Do certain US pharmaceutical companies have patents on HIV medication that they're not releasing, and so countries therefore can't manufacture their own? And if such patents were then like removed, then countries could manufacture their own medication, therefore alleviating some of the problems?
Yeah, absolutely, right, so even if we think about, right, where you, how have I forgotten this? What were our vaccine types? Were you,
Moderna.
Moderna or
Pfizer.
Moderna or Pfizer, right? Like, just like that, so they have patents on that. The way that drug patents generally work is there's like a 30-year patent, so I think so they get basically the market share. They get to determine the market for that drug. And so what PEPFAR did is it made the drugs that cost about $30,000 in America cost about $1 a day or $300. And so that was a negotiated deal that the Bush administration did with this international treaty. And so like that's what I meant, that level of coordination and cooperation internationally to get this pause for this one issue, I think it's going to be really hard to, that's really, I think the thing from PEPFAR that makes it possible and makes it work is getting those drugs cheaply. And so traditionally what the big pharmaceutical companies do, like in the 90s, when the groups in South Africa were, there were all of these movements to get in cheap drugs from Thailand and from India.
Mhm.
And so you had all these folks like sneaking drugs into the country, and you had these companies in India, these large pharmaceutical companies that were run by the state that could produce these pills at $1 a day or less. And so that's how they knew it was possible. The big pharmaceutical companies would come in and sue and say, these are our drugs, you can't do that. And so that's where the negotiations came down. And so that's why, if PEPFAR's gone, then if these countries were to try to buy them themselves, they're going to be at market prices.
And they can't manufacture their own.
And that would
because
be
the
illegal,
US government
right?
will sue.
So messed up.
Right. So there's a really great documentary called Fire in the Blood that looks at the pharmaceutical part of it. And I think you can find it on free online. I think it's not, you don't have to pay for it.
Thank you.
All right, well, you already know I'm gonna ask about Ricky, but I'm gonna ask anyway. Just I have found like I guess I found the conversations around USAID challenging in the last week, right? Because like we know it's a cover for the CAA. We know it's right, a soft power kind of influence used by the US to exert right all kinds of power and influence. But that's not the part Trump's talking about, nor does it seem like it's the part Trump is going after, right? Like, I think,
Right.
But tell me if I'm wrong, like that, the US continuing to exert massive influence all over the world, like that part's not changing. The only thing that's happened is that now people are gonna die. So anyway, will you just like?
I think that's right, Hannah. Yeah.
So yeah, so I guess, right, so
So-
I'm not asking you to sort USAID, although if you could, I would really appreciate it. But I think trying to understand how the PEPFAR fits with, what appears to be, I don't know, the end of or a real allocation of resources from
I think
USAID.
I think there's a pretty simple answer to what.
Good. Ooh, thank goodness.
Maybe a little bit, all right. If you think of this always as a military project, if PEPFAR is always
Mhm.
already being a US national security interest, that's where the money is coming from, that's how it gets allocated, then then that makes sense. And so then the question is, why do we do humanitarian aid, through this lens or through whatever, right? And so we know that USAID has had a tremendous history of using non-lethal support for movements and on the ground actors currently in the world and all over the world, right? And so again, it is a compromise bill under a Republican administration, much more than anybody thought they could have got. And then it was so effective that we don't want to lose it. And so I think I'm also of the question of this is awful, but what does it help us to imagine in terms of humanitarian projects in the future, if we even want to call them that? Because I think for those of us who've been studying PEPFAR, that's also the tension we've struggled with a lot, is that it saves all these lives, but it is embedded in this really gross sort of perversion of Christianity and a gross sort of perversion of security, and all of these sorts of things. And so I don't think that it's necessarily yeah, I'll leave it there. But I think there's a lot more to be said about USAID and like what is the Trump administration's idea of soft power and propaganda and manipulation. Is it really just this? If you don't do what I mean, it's if you don't do what I say, then I'm going to take away the money, right? That seems to be the only strategy or tactic, very effective, but but I don't see like money disappearing from the State Department. I mean, I think that's maybe the key, is that he moved Rubio to be in charge of it. And traditionally, that's how they pretended they didn't talk to the CIA or the Department of Defense, as they were a separate program outside the State Department. And so now they're maybe just making that transparent.
That's super helpful. PEPFAR's military project is, yeah, that's very useful.
Anybody online want to chime in or have a question?
Just makes me think. That's the big thing going on right now, just processing it all. I hadn't even processed my own experiences with HIV abroad, like folks that I had run into and the experiences with it as different from here in the US. So like that just showed my own lack of knowledge and experience with it. So thank you for a really, really well done presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad it was clear.
Can I ask another question?
Please.
So, if you feel like you can answer, what do you think is like, the best case scenario in terms of like where this is going, and what do you think is like the realistic, where it's going? Like, what would be the best case scenario that we can hope for, and then what do you think is like, based on the context of the last like several weeks, what is the most likely?
All right, so best case scenario, I wake up tomorrow, it was all a dream. It wasn't even Harris running, it was Serena Williams, and like everything's fine. So that's probably best case scenario. But I think a little more realistic, right, is that he loses these legal battles and he follows the law. He doesn't fight them. And maybe the funding changes a little bit, but it more or less returns to some sort of normalcy in the yo-yo back and forth. I think that's probably best case scenario in this environment. I think along with all the other things happening, it speaks to a broader constitutional crisis if he doesn't follow the law, if the Supremes come down and say he can't do the things that he's doing. And then I think even more so, if we're thinking about this program in particular, trying to not only save lives, but build trust and be this like benevolent side of America, right? I think there are people that countries that want to take that place. And so I'm very curious what China's going to do in the coming months to all of these places that need billions of dollars for food and in medicine. I'm very curious what Russia does. I'm very curious what happens in terms of regional powers and like how there may be more resistance, right? If he keeps threatening Jordan the way he is, and Jordan decides to figure out new partners, right? You can think about that in terms of a whole bunch of countries where you could see drastic changes because they can't rely on America anymore, right? And so if you can't rely on America and you're constantly threatened with losing funds if you don't do what Trump says, I think countries will make different decisions than they have. What those decisions are, I have no idea. I can't predict. But what I do know is that like whatever outcome has to be influenced by us in the streets, connecting these things together and working in all these groups that we're all a part of to put pressure from the local, state, and federal level to not let people die who don't need to die, right? That like we can save things. I think about that ACT UP quote, right? This was avoidable. And so like if that's sort of a working mantra moving forward, then hopefully things will shift or change. And then obviously electorally, it's going to be the 2026 election when there's possibilities for something bigger and less, who knows?
Unless we have no option for an election in 2026.
Right. I mean, right. Like, who knows? It's going so fast already. So,
Or we wake up from that dream that you.
yeah, that's what I'm hoping.
Patrick Duffy is there, everything is great.
I'm wondering, Ricky, and I don't know if this is a thing you know the answer to either. I'm just thinking, I was so struck by the difference between how people living with AIDS or HIV positive people in the US got framed, and also how much more expensive the medications are than how it gets framed or historically has gotten framed internationally. And I'm trying to think about like why. I'm curious how people agitated around that. Like, it doesn't seem like a great line to be like, the US can afford to have cheap AIDS drugs in Africa. Why can't they be cheap here? Right? Like, there's
Right. Well, because in America, your health is your fault, right? How you are feeling is your problem, right? And so when we think about communicable diseases, right, particularly something like HIV/AIDS, you can't get that alone, and you have to be with another body intimately to get that. Either you got to share blood or some other intimate fluid. And I think that's really different when it's the flu. It's really different when it's even COVID is airborne. We had some, you're not masking, you all of that sort of stuff as well. But it became criminalized really quickly. And so like there's by over 300 laws, and some of them are like bioterrorism laws. Like you can get put in jail for spitting if you have HIV in some states still to this day. And so I think because of the way it was framed in the media and the way that the activism centered, certainly visually early on in the mainstream media, white gay men, and then the proliferation of victim stories from Philadelphia to Dallas Buyers Club to on and on and on portrayed it as that. And then the only national thing that was passed was the Ryan White Care Act. And he was an innocent victim because this was a kid who got it from hemophilia and a blood transfusion. And so there was no innocent victim that they could frame the policy around effectively, and at least before antiretrovirals. And that has never really dislodged itself from the political imagination about it. And so I think what ends up happening in the culture is people think about HIV/AIDS as a joke, right? Like I love that show Veep, but like the problem with that show is that every episode is an AIDS joke, right? Like when they want to make her meaningless in the vice presidency, they give her the office of national AIDS, right? And they're like, and so it's something that is seen as your fault. Oops, you did it. That's too bad, right? That you got AIDS. What an idiot. You should have known better. And it's not one that has ever drawn compassion from at least the American public. So I don't know if that answers it all, but
no, it was helpful. Yeah, I think I was just struck by like the right, there's the powerful arguments for international solidarity when it comes to ensuring that people in other countries get these life-saving medications. And then like, how do you articulate the argument for international solidarity when the it's more criminalized and more expensive here? But I think you answered it just
Yeah,
in
yeah.
like,
And then also something you said made me reflect back on how you said that the abortion issue was really what they used to extend it for another year because they couldn't get
Right.
so that um that didn't die previously either, like that's still intertwined with all of these issues and is used, the misinformation of that is used, this weaponized.
Yeah. Well, every time that it comes up for renewal, they do this, right?
Yeah.
And so they say, oh, this is being used for abortions. And then what has happened the previous times is Representative Pence and Representative Smith would come in and say, no, guys, we got this. We made sure the law doesn't do this, right? But they're gone now. And so like, they're not there to uphold that. And so in 2021, when Biden undid the global gag rule, and that opened up this argument that we're now facing today. That was the seeds of them saying that all of this is used for woke gender ideology. There's inefficiency, corruption, all of this stuff that is just not factually based, but very politically powerful, becomes the organizing principle. And so, I think that's part of it. And then I think, I don't know what the Biden administration was thinking, why they didn't fight this harder. I think it's the only time since George W. Bush has been out of office that he actually came out and wrote something political and said something right. He wrote a whole thing about why it should be saved. The Bush Center did all of this advocacy trying to get Republicans to support it, and they wouldn't. And so all they would do is a 1 year renewal when it's supposed to get a 5 year renewal. And so like had it had a 5 year renewal, we might not be thinking about it at all under the Trump administration, right? But unfortunately that's happened. And so then there's the question of what's next. Are they gonna put it in the budget reconciliation when they do that next month? Are they going to use it as leverage against these 55 countries? But either way, if you're a doctor who wants to save lives and you're an AIDS doctor, you're not gonna want to work for these people like at all. Like I wouldn't. So like anyway, I don't know if that gets at everything.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think, can I make one last comment? I
I'm
think
not the bottom.
your comment made me think of like, I think for a long time, America was framed as like being exceptional. So
Mhm.
people never even stopped to question like, oh, why are AIDS drugs in America so expensive? Because they always thought everything in America is so much better than in other countries. So they never even like thought to check. And so part of that is like the idea that America is always kind of framed as like standing apart and being like better. And so that kind of suppresses people's willingness to question anything. And that's kind of we're kind of seeing that right now where it's like, oh, America is like still this, people still believe that America is this great country and we're like, things are not good here. They're like so much better in other places. And they're like, this is the best it could be. And I'm like, no, it could be so much better. Like, look over here. It's like,
Look anywhere.
yeah.
Okay, well, if there's nothing else from online, I'd just like to take another opportunity to thank you for presenting.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And I'll give a brief announcement. Our next ABC session will be March 11th at 7 o'clock here in person and on Zoom as well. I see some.
Oh, they're claps.
Yeah, I thought they
Yeah.
were hand raised. Yes. And that will be Charlie here will be presenting on the challenges faced by LGBTQ plus populations in incarcerated settings, with special emphasis on healthcare needs, trans populations, safety risks, and existing protections. And yeah, so if you're interested in that, that's March 11th at 7. Thank you everyone for
coming. Really
attending.
appreciate it.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Bye, Owl.